New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. You might say I'm Jeffrey Mishlove's conversation partner and alter ego. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a new book about which I am very excited. It is called A New Science of Heaven, written by Robert Temple. I have never met Robert Temple. I have never corresponded with him. I have never spoken with him in any way whatsoever, but I can say that I regard him as something of a polymath, and I would even go so far as to say a genius. At the same time, I want to be very clear that I don't agree with everything he has said. Nevertheless, I do agree that this is a very important and provocative book, and I want to share it with you. One of Robert Temple's key insights is a very simple one, and it's a basic fact. The universe is made 99.9% out of plasma. That is the foundation of his entire argument right there. Well, what is plasma? We have to start there. And he makes an important point, which is that there are different definitions for plasma. And one of them, which I think everyone is familiar with, is that plasma has something to do with the blood and blood transfusion and things of that sort. But Temple is very clear that is not the kind of plasma we are referring to here. The type of plasma we're talking about is what you might call ionized particles, particles that are not yet atoms. They are protons, they are electrons, they are ions of different kinds. They often exist in outer space in these giant nebula clouds, which could be thought of as dusty plasma. And dusty plasma exists because it has what we think of as space dust. And plasma clouds can be enormous in size. They can stretch across light years. But we think of the physical universe as composed of atoms and molecules. That's what matter is to us. Plasma is pre-atomic. It existed before atoms were ever formed in the very early moments of the universe after the Big Bang. So you might say that the entire physical universe that we experience, rocks and trees and our bodies and planets, all grew out of plasma. They were created from the initial plasma that still constitutes 99.9% of the entire universe. For example, the sun is made of plasma. In fact, all stars are made of plasma. You might say, therefore, that the galaxy itself is largely all plasma. If you look at this beautiful picture, for example, of our sister galaxy, the Andromeda galaxy, stretching almost 200,000 light years across, it's primarily plasma, 99.9%. It's not atoms. It's not molecules. And not only that, it contains enormous electrical charge. Atoms are ions. They are positive and negative charges. But even more so, Robert Temple cites an enormous body of research suggesting that plasma has properties of autopoiesis. Autopoiesis means the ability to organize itself, and there are theorists like Francisco Varela and Ilya Prigogine who suggest that this is the very basis of life, that matter itself, and in particular in this case, plasma clouds, sometimes known as plasmoids, can organize themselves into what might well be living conscious entities. So we're talking about the possibility that giant clouds in space could be conscious. Or minimally speaking, they can function like supercomputers, maybe not conscious, not sentient like we are, but more powerful than the largest supercomputers on Earth, perhaps trillions of times more powerful than the largest computers on Earth. And what if they are indeed conscious entities? What if, in fact, the entire universe is conscious? This, of course, is an ancient idea. And it is an idea to which Robert Temple subscribes, and it is an idea to which I subscribe. The entire universe is conscious. And Temple makes a point of showing us maps that have been created rather recently in the field of cosmology, looking at the large-scale structure of the universe. And he compares it to maps looking at the microscopic structure of the human brain, where you see these neurons with the nucleus of the neuron and axons and dendrites reaching out from the nucleus and connecting with thousands of other neurons to create our brain. And Robert Temple points out, like many other people have also done, that these structures are remarkably similar. And so he speculates, could it be that the whole universe functions like a giant brain? And get this, the plasma entities that fill the universe and stretch out for light years contain filaments. That's what they're called, little threads of plasma. You see, there's an enormous structure inside of these plasmoid bodies. They organize themselves, and Robert Temple claims that if a human being were made out of plasma, and actually he suggests that we are, but he says the plasma human is even more complex than the flesh and blood human. He maintains that we are really plasma beings inhabiting an atomic body made of atoms and molecules, but the real control is at the plasma level, and that when we die, our plasma body separates out the parts from the physical body, and perhaps we'll jump into a new one, because, of course, Robert Temple is an advocate of reincarnation. But here's where it gets really juicy. I first learned about Robert Temple's work back in the mid-1970s when I was still a graduate student at Berkeley, and I was still very much under the influence of a man who I regard as my mentor in those years, Arthur M. Young, who founded the Institute for the Study of Consciousness, who invented the Bell helicopter, who wrote The Reflexive Universe and the Geometry of Meaning, an amazing cosmologist and profound thinker. Arthur Young, back in the 1970s, told me I should be paying attention to this fellow Robert Temple, who had written a new book, which was then very popular, called The Serious Mystery. He called attention to the fact that the Dogon people of Africa believed that they had descended from the star Sirius. And Temple's book was all about mythology concerning the star Sirius and the possibility that perhaps some humans on this planet actually came from a civilization associated with the star Sirius. Let me say a bit more about Robert Temple as well. The man got his doctoral degree in Sanskrit studies. He also co-authored a book called The Genius of China with a Chinese scholar, Needham. And that book has been approved as a textbook for Chinese students in China to learn about their own country. In addition, Robert Temple has been a science journalist. He's worked with many leading organizations, Time Life, for example, The Guardian, and many others. He has become a personal friend of any number of Nobel laureates. And in the context of doing his work as a science journalist, he became well acquainted with many leading edge areas of science. We're talking about such things as autopoiesis and the idea that physical systems can organize themselves into living conscious beings. Now, as I was learning about Robert Temple and his book, I began watching a number of his interviews on YouTube, and I discovered the most amazing fact that had been completely unknown to me. Robert Temple pointed out, and I should say this, he's 1 year older than me. He was born in 1945. I was born at the end of 1946. But he indicates that between the ages of 16 and 21, he had a very close relationship with none other than Arthur M. Young. In fact, he says he helped Arthur M. Young write his two most important books, The Reflexive Universe and The Geometry of Meaning. Well, this got my attention because Arthur M. Young is one of the most important people in my life, even though he died almost 30 years ago. And I came to see that Robert Temple embodies some of the same genius qualities that I found in Arthur M. Young. Primarily, he's not afraid to take an anti-establishment point of view. He's not afraid to look very closely at ideas that are rejected by the mainstream. He's not afraid to strike out on a new path, completely independent of work that has been done before him, or at least partially independent of that. But I want to also point out that there is an important way in which Robert Temple's thinking deviates from the thinking of my mentor and a person who was obviously his mentor at a very crucial time in his life, Arthur M. Young. You see, in The Reflexive Universe, the cosmology that Young describes has 4 primary levels that he associates with the 4 major categories of the human being, according to classical philosophy, according to Aristotle, for example, body, mind, soul, and spirit. But I think what Robert Temple has done here, primarily in his interviews, and not so much in the book itself, Robert Temple is very clear that what he is writing about are speculations. The idea that a plasmoid cloud in outer space could be a conscious entity is a speculation. It's grounded on a lot of research, on findings, particularly findings by Russian plasma researchers about the ability of plasma systems to begin to develop complex internal structures and to organize themselves. But to say that that leads to a conscious entity, well, it's a speculation, to be honest. We don't know that as a fact. If he lectures to the Science and Medical Network in Europe, or he lectures to the Theosophical Society in New Zealand, he basically says that the plasma being is the same as the spiritual being, that our plasma body is the same as our spiritual body. And in so doing, he ignores the distinction that Arthur Young is careful to make between spirit and soul. Arthur Young points out that the spirit is associated with purpose. that each of us has a purpose in life, and it is connected with our spirit. And other writers would go so far as to say the spirit is the observer. It watches everything, but it doesn't participate so much as an actor. That's the role of the soul. Well, different theorists will say different things about this, but one thing we can say is that the soul in Arthur Young's theory is related to the concept of charge, to attraction and repulsion, to emotions, to the things we are drawn to or repugnated. That's a new word, I think, repugnated by. I have to add that to the dictionary if it's not already there. I think it is a big mistake to try and equate the spiritual being, even the soulful being of the human being, with plasma. It's true that plasma is not atomic matter. Plasma doesn't form atoms. Well, it can create atoms, but it's not made out of atoms, except to the extent that dust is mixed in with the charged particles in outer space and in the plasmas that exist there. So it's a mixture, which makes it very, very complex. And Robert Temple, to his credit, goes into a great detail about how the space dust can actually be created by the plasma because it's full of ions and electrons and protons. And if an ion, which is a positively charged particle, collides with an electron, attracts that electron or several electrons, it could become an atom. It could become a molecule or a group of molecules. And it is this thinking that suggests that actual physical matter, atomic matter, gets created out of plasma. Very important point. Temple also goes to great length to talk about the work of Brian Josephson, who was a colleague, actually, of mine because of his strong interest in parapsychology. Back in 1972 or 3, Brian Josephson received the Nobel Prize for when he was still, as I recall, a graduate student in physics at Cambridge, for coming up with what is known as the Josephson junction. And Robert Temple goes to great length to point out that the Josephson junction is now thought to be potentially the basis for quantum computers, which are still under development, because the Josephson junction can act as a switch, can let a single electron pass or not pass through it. And that, we're now talking about something, a subatomic particle at the quantum physical level. Robert Temple suggests that if plasmoid bodies are full of, he believes, trillions of these Josephson junctions capable of self-organizing itself into a massive supercomputer. There's no reason to think that a massive supercomputer is necessarily conscious. But we don't know how these things are programmed. Supercomputers on Earth are programmed by humans. They follow algorithms. A supercomputer that programs itself through the process of autopoiesis would be different. And for all we know, it could develop consciousness. We can't rule it out. But Robert Temple goes so far as to assume, at least in his interviews and public lectures, that giant plasmoid clouds, like the whole rest of the universe, are indeed conscious and have the capability of trillions of times more computing power than the largest supercomputers on Earth. And that hypothesis, I'll call it a hypothesis. It's certainly not, in my mind, a foregone conclusion. But that hypothesis is enormously significant if true. We can't ignore the possibilities, the ramifications and implications of that hypothesis if true. And that's the genius, I think, of Robert Temple right there. These ideas bear a strong relationship to the puzzle that is confronting humanity right now about UFOs and UAP. There are thousands of reported instances of individuals here on this planet interacting with some forms of non-human intelligence. You could call them aliens. You could call them machine elves. You could call them mantids or reptilians. You could call them energy beings. You could call them Nordics. But they all have certain amazing capabilities. They seem to be able to walk through walls. They seem to be able to appear and disappear at will. They seem to be able to change their form and shape according to various circumstances. They seem to be able to travel at speeds that would kill a being if it were a flesh and blood animal-like creature such as a human, traveling at thousands of miles an hour and making right-angle turns, for example. That could kill a human being. But think about it this way for a moment. Let us suppose that plasmoid bodies in outer space could be the sun, for example, or it could be, and Robert Temple makes a big deal about what he calls the Kordylewski clouds. This is central to his thinking. And I imagine 99% of you viewing this video right now have never even heard that phrase before, the Kordylewski clouds. This is another example of Robert Temple's genius because he managed, because of his study of plasma, to search out a very obscure finding in astrophysics. The Kordylewski clouds, I think, were first discovered in 1961 or so by a Polish researcher, Kordylewski, and then they were ignored. They're giant plasma clouds, each one about 9 times the size of the Earth, and they are located at 2 Lagrange points in outer space. The Lagrange points are equidistant from the Earth and the Moon, I believe 60 degrees away from the Moon on either side. I think I have that correct. I might be a little off, but the point is these are points where the gravitational attraction of the Earth and the Moon equal each other out. So there's gravitational stability at those points. And Kordylewski found 2 giant plasmoid bodies there. It took until, I think, 2019 before his discovery could be replicated and confirmed. But now it has been. And that is what spurred Robert Temple to write this book. These plasmoid clouds, they're invisible to the naked eye because the ions and particles and even dust in the cloud they're so thin you can't see it with the naked eye at all. In fact, for the most part, you can't see galaxies or nebula in the sky through the naked eye. You can through telescopes and very sensitive measuring equipment. Robert Temple speculates that these 2 Kordylewski clouds hovering between the Earth and the Moon may have been there for billions of years, may be conscious entities, may have been watching and observing life on Earth for over 1 billion years. And because of their vast size, each cloud 9 times the size of the Earth, each cloud potentially functioning like a brain, like an enormous supercomputer, would have the capability of storing in its memory all the knowledge of every plant and animal and virus that's ever existed on the Earth since the beginning of life, having been formed here. He goes so far. Well, let me put it this way. Other people have also jumped onto the bandwagon. There are many interviews with Robert Temple because his book first came out in 2022, 2023, a couple of years ago. So people speculate. What are these drones? What are these UFO sightings? Could it be that conscious entities in outer space are capable of projecting their thoughts and causing these things to appear because they use them to monitor us, to observe us? We are part of a project that they have been observing for aeons. And they have the capability, just as we do. In the literature of parapsychology, it's well known. Some individuals can project their thoughts. They can create an apparition of themselves that will be seen by other people. And those apparitions may take different forms, may look like them or may look like something else if they wish to project an image of something else. And it may seem very physical to people. Perhaps apparitions can even be photographed and measured. So the idea is, even to the extent that they are physical, just as a talented human being can project psychokinetically an image of themselves or can move an object at a distant location, the images that we see and identify as UFOs or UAP could be projections from conscious entities, from other life forms that we barely even recognize as life forms because they're not organic, they're not biological in the sense that we are. There could be inorganic life forms, fully conscious, more powerful than the most powerful supercomputers on Earth, 1 trillion times, 1 trillion times more powerful than the most powerful supercomputers that we have today. And they've been observing us for millions of years and know everything about us and have the capability of projecting all sorts of phenomena that strike us as paranormal and interact with us, that the religions on Earth, the esoteric traditions on Earth, the fairy lore on Earth, the UFO lore on Earth may all, or at least partially, be a consequence of these beings. I think that is an incredible insight. Now, Robert Temple offers many, many more insights. He is, for example, an advocate of the electric universe theory. He believes, for example, that the sun is not powered by nuclear fission. It's not a big nuclear bomb, an H-bomb. He notes, for example, that as best we can measure it, the deeper you go into the interior of the sun, the colder it gets. It's not what we would expect from the conventional theory. So he's basically saying we need to rethink how we look at the universe as a whole. And I think he's right about that. We don't appreciate the role of plasma. On the other hand, I think it's a big mistake to suggest that we can account for the spiritual nature of the human being simply by looking at plasma. I think plasma plays an important role. I think we have much, much to learn about plasma. It has been neglected for far too long. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that we now can understand the entire spiritual nature of the human being by looking at plasma. I don't go that far. Robert Temple apparently does. Well, I've been banging on for a long time about this book. We will be having a live stream event when I'm going to take questions from viewers. That'll be in another week or so. I wanted to create this InPresence monologue, dialogue with myself now in preparation for that event. I continue to think that Robert Temple is a very important thinker for people today who want to understand more deeply what's going on with things like UFOs and where is science really taking us today. I hope to have him as a guest on New Thinking Aloud, but for now, you've got me. So thank you very much for being with me. After all, you are the reason why we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy, go to newthinkingaloud.org.